Goliath, or Goliath of Gath, was a giant Philistine warrior defeated by the young David, the future king of Israel. In the Bible's books of Samuel, the original purpose of the story was to show David's identity as the true king of Israel. Post-classical Jewish traditions stressed Goliath's status as the representative of paganism, in contrast to David, the champion of the God of Israel. Christian tradition gave him a distinctively Christian perspective, seeing in David's battle with Goliath the victory of God's king over the enemies of God's helpless people as a prefiguring of Jesus' victory over sin on the cross and the Church's victory over Satan. The phrase, David and Goliath, has taken on a more secular meaning, denoting an underdog situation, a contest where a smaller, weaker opponent faces a much bigger, stronger adversary. Biblical account. The account of the battle between David and Goliath is told in 1 Samuel, chapter 17. Saul and the Israelites are facing the Philistines near the valley of Elah. Twice a day for 40 days, Goliath, the champion of the Philistines, comes out between the lines and challenges the Israelites to send out a champion of their own to decide the outcome in single combat. But Saul and all the Israelites are afraid. David, bringing food for his elder brothers, hears that Goliath had defied the armies of God and of the reward from Saul to the one that defeats him, and accepts the challenge. Saul reluctantly agrees and offers his armor, which David declines, taking only his staff, sling and 5 stones from a brook. David and Goliath confront each other, Goliath with his armor and javelin, David with his staff and sling. The Philistine cursed David by his gods, but David replies, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that God saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is God's, and he will give you into our hand." David hurls a stone from his sling with all his might and hits Goliath in the center of his forehead. Goliath falls on his face to the ground, and David cuts off his head. The Philistines flee and are pursued by the Israelites, as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron. David puts the armor of Goliath in his own tent and takes the head to Jerusalem, and Saul sends Abner to bring the boy to him. The king asks whose son he is, and David answers, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." Textual considerations. Textual history. The earliest manuscripts, such as the 4th century AD Codex Vaticanus Graecus 1209, do not contain the verses describing David coming each day with food for his brothers, nor 1 Samuel chapter 17 verses 55 to 58, in which Saul seems unaware of David's identity, referring to him as "this youth," and asking Abner to find out the name of his father. The narrative therefore reads that Goliath challenges the Israelites to combat. The Israelites are afraid, and David, already with Saul, accepts the challenge. This removes a number of ambiguities which have puzzled commentators. It removes 1 Samuel chapter 17 verses 55 to 58, in which Saul seems not to know David, despite having taken him as his shield-bearer and harpist. It removes 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 50, the presence of which makes it seem as if David kills Goliath twice, once with his sling and then again with a sword, and it gives David a clear reason, as Saul's personal shield-bearer, for accepting Goliath's challenge. Scholars drawing on studies of oral transmission and folklore have concluded that the non-Septuagint material is a folktale grafted onto the initial text of 1 Samuel. Goliath's height. Goliath's stature grew at the hand of narrators or scribes. The oldest manuscripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls text of Samuel, the 1st century historian Josephus, and the 4th century Septuagint manuscripts, all give his height as 4 cubits and a span, whereas the Masoretic text gives this as 6 cubits and a span. Goliath's injury and fall. The biblical account describes Goliath as falling on his face after he is struck by a stone that sank into his forehead. British Rabbi Jonathan Magonet has discussed some of the textual difficulties this raises. In the first place, he notes that archaeological information suggests that Philistine helmets generally had a forehead covering, in some cases extending down to the nose. Why should David aim at such an impenetrable spot? And why should Goliath fall forward when struck by something heavy enough to stop him, rather than backwards? An answer to both questions, Magonet suggests, lies in the Hebrew word mitzvah, normally translated forehead. A word almost identical with it appears earlier in the passage, the word mitzchat, translated as greaves, the flexible leg armor that protected Goliath's lower leg. It is possible, grammatically in the passage, for the same word to be used in verse 49, a reconstruction of which replacing with would imply that the stone sank down behind Goliath's leg armor, making it impossible for him to straighten his leg, and causing him to stumble and fall. Then David removed the head of Goliath to show all that the giant was killed. Elhanan and Goliath. Goliath makes another appearance in 2 Samuel chapter 21 verse 19, which tells how Goliath the Gittite was killed by Elhanan the son of Jaare-Oregim, the Bethlehemite. The 4th century BC 1 Chronicles explains the second Goliath by saying that Elhanan slew Lama the brother of Goliath, apparently constructing the name Lama from the last portion of the word Bethlehemite. The King James Bible translators adopted this into their translation of 2 Samuel chapter 21 verses 18 to 19, although the Hebrew text at this point makes no mention of the word brother. Most likely, storytellers displaced the deed from the otherwise obscure Elhanan onto the more famous character David. Goliath and the Philistines. Tel Es-Safi, the biblical Gath and traditional home of Goliath, has been the subject of extensive excavations by Israel's Bar-Ilan University. The archaeologists have established that this was one of the largest of the Philistine cities until destroyed in the 9th century BC, an event from which it never recovered. A potsherd discovered at the site, unreliably dated to the 10th to mid-9th centuries BC, is inscribed with the two names, ALWT and WLT. While the names are not directly connected with the biblical Goliath, they are etymologically related and demonstrate that the name fits with the context of late 10th, early 9th century BC Philistine culture. The name Goliath itself is non-Semitic and has been linked with the Lydian king Goliaths, which also fits the Philistine context of the biblical Goliath story. A similar name of Uliat is also attested in Carian inscriptions. Aaron Meir, director of the excavation, comments, "Here we have very nice evidence that the name Goliath appearing in the Bible in the context of the story of David and Goliath is not some later literary creation. Goliath and Saul. The underlying purpose of the story of Goliath is to show that Saul is not fit to be king. Saul was chosen to lead the Israelites against their enemies, but when faced with Goliath he refuses to do so. Goliath is a giant, and Saul is a very tall man. His exact height is not given, but he was a head taller than anyone else in all Israel, which implies he was over 6 feet tall and the obvious challenger for Goliath. Also, Saul's armor and weaponry are apparently no worse than Goliath's. David declares that when a lion or bear came and attacked his father's sheep, he battled against it and killed it. But Saul has been cowering in fear instead of rising up and attacking the threat to his sheep. Goliath and the Greeks. The armor described in 1 Samuel chapter 17 appears typical of Greek armor of the 6th century BC rather than of Philistines' armor of the 10th century. Narrative formulae such as the settlement of battle by single combat between champions has been thought characteristic of the Homeric epics, rather than of the ancient Near East. The designation of Goliath as a man of the in-between appears to be a borrowing from Greek man of the metaikmon, i.e., the space between two opposite army camps where champion combat would take place. A story very similar to that of David and Goliath appears in the Iliad, written circa 760–710 BC, where the young Nestor fights and conquers the giant Eruthalion. Each giant wields a distinctive weapon, an iron club in Eruthalion's case, a massive bronze spear in Goliath's. Each giant, clad in armor, comes out of the enemy's massed array to challenge all the warriors in the opposing army. In each case the seasoned warriors are afraid, and the challenge is taken up by a stripling, the youngest in his family. In each case an older and more experienced father figure tells the boy that he is too young and inexperienced. But in each case the young hero receives divine aid and the giant is left sprawling on the ground. Nestor, fighting on foot, then takes the chariot of his enemy, while David, on foot, takes the sword of Goliath. The enemy army then flees, the victors pursue and slaughter them in return with their bodies, and the boy hero is acclaimed by the people. The theory that the two stories are directly related has been contested on several grounds. Heavy metal armor like that worn by Goliath is attested for the late Bronze Age as well as in the writings of Homer. Duels between tribal champions predate the Iliadic material and were by no means exclusive to Grecian warriors, and the hypothesis that the Sinai leadership title ascribed only to the Philistines in the Bible reflects the Greek tyrannos is difficult. Philologically, James Hoffmeyer argues that the Iliadic parallel has little value for interpreting the Hebrew narrative, which exemplifies features that were long available to Middle Eastern tradition. Later traditions, Jewish. According to the Babylonian Talmud, Goliath was a son of Orpah, the sister-in-law of Ruth, David's own great-grandmother. Ruth Rabbah, a Haggadic and homiletic interpretation of the Book of Ruth, makes the blood relationship even closer, considering Orpah and Ruth to have been full sisters. Orpah was said to have made a pretense of accompanying Ruth, but after 40 paces left her. Thereafter she led a dissolute life. According to the Jerusalem Talmud, Goliath was born by polyspermy, and had about 100 fathers. The Talmud stresses the Thrasonical Goliath's ungodliness. His taunts before the Israelites included the boast that it was he who had captured the Ark of the Covenant and brought it to the Temple of Dagon, and his challenges to combat were made at morning and evening in order to disturb the Israelites in their prayers. His armor weighed 60 tons, according to Rabbi Hanina, 120, according to Rabbi Abba bar Kahana, and his sword, which became the sword of David, had marvelous powers. On his death it was found that his heart carried the image of Dagon, who thereby also came to a shameful downfall. In Pseudo-Philo, believed to have been composed between 135 BCE and 70 CE, David picks up 7 stones and writes on them the names of his fathers, his own name, and the name of God, one name per stone. Then, speaking to Goliath, he says, "Hear this word before you die. Were not the 2 women from whom you and I were born sisters? And your mother was Orpah and my mother Ruth." After David strikes Goliath with the stone, he runs to Goliath before he dies, and Goliath says, "Hurry and kill me and rejoice." And David replies, "Before you die, open your eyes and see your slayer." Goliath sees an angel and tells David that it is not he who has killed him but the angel. Pseudo-Philo then goes on to say that the angel of the Lord changes David's appearance so that no one recognizes him, and thus Saul asks who he is. Islam. Goliath appears in chapter 2 of the Quran, in the narrative of David and Saul's battle against the Philistines. Called Jalut in Arabic, Goliath's mention in the Quran is concise, though it remains a parallel to the account in the Hebrew Bible. Muslim scholars have tried to trace Goliath's origins, most commonly with the Amalekites. Goliath, in early scholarly tradition, became a kind of byword or collective name for the oppressors of the Israelite nation before David. Muslim tradition sees the battle with the Philistines as a prefiguration of Muhammad's Battle of Badr, and sees Goliath as parallel to the enemies that the prophet faced. Adaptations. American actor Ted Cassidy portrayed Goliath in the TV series Greatest Heroes of the Bible in 1978. Italian actor Luigi Montefiore portrayed this 9-foot-tall giant in Paramount's 1985 live-action movie King David as part of a flashback. The PBS series Wishbone featured Goliath in its first season episode, Little Big Dog. Big Idea's popular VeggieTales episode was called Dave and the Giant Pickle, where Phil Vischer voiced Goliath. In 1972, Toho and Tsuburaya Productions collaborated on a movie called Daguerre vs. Goliath, which follows the story relatively closely but recasts the main characters as kaiju. In 2005, Lightstone Studios released a direct-to-DVD movie musical titled One Smooth Stone, which was later changed to David and Goliath. It is part of the Like and the Scriptures series of movie musicals on DVD based on scripture stories. Thurl Bailey, a former NBA basketball player, was cast to play the part of Goliath in this film. Goliath was portrayed by Conan Stevens in the 2013 TV miniseries The Bible. Italian Goliath film series. The Italians used Goliath as an action superhero in a series of biblical adventure films in the early 1960s. He possessed amazing strength, and the films were similar in theme to their Hercules and Miss Sister movies. After the classic Hercules became a blockbuster sensation in the film industry, a 1959 Steve Reeves film Terra dei Barbari was retitled Goliath and the Barbarians in the United States. The film was so successful at the box office, it inspired Italian filmmakers to do a series of 4 more films featuring a beefcake hero named Goliath, although the films were not really related to each other. The 4 titles in the Italian Goliath series were as follows: Goliath contro I Giganti, Goliath Against the Giants starring Brad Harris, Goliath e la Schiava Ribble, Goliath and the Rebel Slave starring Gordon Scott, Goliath e il Cavaliere Masterato, Goliath and the Masked Rider starring Alan Steele, Goliath alla Conquista di Baghdad, Goliath at the Conquest of Baghdad starring Peter Lupus. The name Goliath was later inserted into the film titles of 3 other Italian Muscleman movies that were retitled for distribution in the United States in an attempt to cash in on the Goliath craze. But these films were not originally made as Goliath movies in Italy. Both Goliath and the Vampires and Goliath and the Sins of Babylon actually featured the famed superhero Mephisto in the original Italian versions. But American distributors didn't feel the name Mephisto had any meaning to American audiences. Goliath and the Dragon was originally an Italian Hercules movie called The Revenge of Hercules. Modern usage of David and Goliath. In recent usage, the phrase, David and Goliath, has taken on a secular meaning, denoting an underdog situation, a contest where a smaller, weaker opponent faces a much bigger, stronger adversary. If successful, the underdog may win in an unusual or surprising way. It is arguably the most famous underdog story. Theology professor Leonard Greenspoon, in his essay, David vs. Goliath in the Sports Pages, explains that most writers use the story for its underdog overtones. Less likely to show up in newsprint is the contrast that was most important to the biblical authors. David's victory shows the power of his God, while Goliath's defeat reveals the weakness of the Philistine deities. The phrase is widely used in news media to succinctly characterize underdog situations in every conceivable context, without religious overtones. Recent headlines include sports, business, entertainment and the arts, politics, social justice.